will translate once that gets to sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia. And at the moment, we don't know. And I think at the moment, one of the biggest protections for countries in sub-Saharan Africa has been the fact that Europe and North America closed their citizens to external travel. And that's been the greatest gift to the rest of the world to help them get a bit more prepared. Australia, as you would know, much more intimately, has done remarkably well. And I think this is, you know, we talk about the Australian spirit as one of larrikinism and, you know, casual, she'll be right sort of attitudes. But as a population, we're actually quite, we're good at following advice. We trust our authorities. We you know, we might be quite skeptical of some motives, but we generally trust our health experts, and the compliance to the interventions that have been put in place have, I think, surprised everybody in how successful they have been. Depending on how big the screen you're looking at, this might be really helpful or a complete waste of time, but the Australian government puts out these updates very regularly. This is from last Thursday evening. Sorry, I should have updated this one. It's updated every afternoon. But we know that in Australia, we have really got that curve down, as we spend a lot of time pushing the message about flattening the curve. Basically, if you model an epidemic, if you know that in normal circumstances, one person infects, say, between 2 to 3 people, and they infect them, you know, that transmission happens every 5 days or so, you can get a very rapid, as we know, exponential growth in the number of cases. And despite the case fatality rate being, you know, probably around the sort of 2 to 5%, that translates, when it's a whole population, to an enormous number of people needing hospital care, needing ICU care, and perhaps needing assisted ventilation. Australia has had about 2,000 ICU beds at the beginning of this outbreak. But, you know, getting extra beds is okay. Getting expert nursing staff who can manage intensive care management isn't something you can do overnight. And so a lot of the strategies were to really decrease the burden on the health system. And the sort of model there, pictured there, is, you know, the grey bar is when nothing happens. The blue is where you quarantine people who've come in contact with somebody who's positive, and you isolate all known positive cases. And then the final darker blue curve, much lower, sort of lifts you under the health system capacity of an area, is where you add the social distancing as your strategy. And if we look at Australia's curve, this is our cases, daily cases. What we can see, and today's is less again, if we overlay our national responses to this curve, we see this quite neat picture that around the end of March, where we had on the 28th of March, where we had our peak daily rate of 460 cases confirmed in one day, that was when the day before our peak intervention of, you know, only 2 people meeting outside, or in the case of Victoria, inside as well. And there'd been a rapid increase, scaling up of the restrictions in, you know, mass gatherings being stopped, then stopping arrivals from certain countries, then the do not travel, and basically our borders closing and then compulsory quarantine for visitors. And I think Australia was very fortunate in making those calls at the stage of the epidemic that we did in this country, because the timing, really it was that sort of do not travel, and the staying at home is the week before the peak area. So I think the peak time, and that's basically you know, part of that period from infection to actually showing symptoms, that we managed the approach, the response was, we were very fortunate in the timing of that. So we've come to this situation now where our recoveries are far outweighing our active cases. All of that beautiful preparedness of the hospitals has got everybody with good, systems in place. And because we've got now a larger capacity to test, we can start doing the strategy of, as has happened in WA today, of starting to ease up and have a really good testing strategy in place to, should there be any small flare-ups, to be able to identify them quickly and to isolate and quarantine any contacts. So we've done really well. And globally, I think I'm a big fan of WHO, and they're the first port of call for any advice. But their advice has been really clear right from the beginning, that there are 3 real strategies around slowing and stopping transmission, preventing outbreaks and delaying spread. And that really involves really clear communication and strong engagement of the community. As we all know, Development 101, if you don't bring everybody with you, then you're not going to get very far, particularly when you're asking people to do things that they've never had to live with before. The public health measures of hand hygiene, social distancing, active case finding, which is dependent on testing capacity, and then quarantine of contacts and isolation of cases. So that's the sort of outbreak management. And then there's optimised care for all patients, which includes a lot of supportive care, a lot of oxygen management, and then and prone care seems to be working, nursing people on their front. And the ventilators, we got very excited about ventilators globally over the last 6 weeks. And, it's a real fear for countries like Nepal, where ICU capacity is very limited and ventilators in particular are very scarce. Probably there's a lot we can do before you need a ventilator, that people are trying to actually defer putting people on ventilators even when they are available in many settings at the moment. So the oxygen care is really the mainstay of treatment. And then the third prong of that approach around managing this pandemic is addressing the impacts on health systems, on social services and economic activity. And I want to spend the last few minutes just thinking about what they are, that third area, and the challenges involved. In Australia, we've had the fortune to be able to, do some large, very big financial protection schemes to counter the disadvantage of all of the restrictions that were placed on people and their ability to work. But if you think of a country like Nepal or India, where 80% of your workforce are in the informal sector, that capacity to provide any social protection and yet closing all shops and economic activity, marketplaces down, there's a huge effect of a challenge to that, not the least of which is that casual workforce will go home from cities. So you might have a large urban workforce that then go back home because at least in the villages, they'll be able to find food. And we saw that when India gave their population 4 hours notice of a lockdown, and suddenly you had millions of people walking, some were walking 400 kilometres back home without any protection, food on the route, right at the hottest time of the year. So some devastating consequences of some of the policies. And yet we've done that because we're preserving our health system capacity, and yet some countries have no health system capacity to preserve. We've done a lot of our actions to protect the vulnerable elderly, and that's a really appropriate response, especially in countries like Europe, where the median age of the population is 40 years old. So more than half the population are over 40. And a significant population are over 60, where there's a slightly increased risk of the older you are, your case fatality rate, the likelihood of dying if you became infected, is much higher. But in many low and middle income countries, the median age is about 18. So you have a much younger population, and hopefully that will act as a big protection, but it also makes you want to rethink the response a little bit for who are the vulnerable in these contexts. It may not be the same group that are vulnerable in Italy or in New York. And then because tuberculosis is so widespread in many low and middle income countries, there's a real sense that protection for people with pre-existing conditions is really important. So that social distancing, and really, that's turned into lockdown in many settings, may have some advantages for those who have TB. But the challenges, I think, are quite considerable. And I think this is where perhaps everyone here's interest might be around the major disruptions to routine health services. Already we're hearing of children not receiving routine immunisations, and the biggest killers of children under 5, many of them are vaccine preventable diseases. HIV, interestingly enough, doesn't seem to put you at any greater, if you're living with HIV, you don't seem to be at greater risk of more severe illness from COVID-19. However, the downside is that because everything's shut and transport is down, people trying to actually access treatment, their routine antiretrovirals every month, they're not able to do that. And we know with HIV that the continuity of treatment is really critical to its success. And the economic crisis is going to be enormous in places where, as has happened, most of the world's population has been really shut down. And at the moment, more of the world's population live in cities than not. That tipping point happened a couple of years ago. So it's not that the rural populations are preserved, because in most low and middle income countries now you have very large populations in cities now shut down with no safety nets. And, the very people who make the food in those settings are the ones without the jobs and can't access food themselves. We've seen that in stark reality in what happened after the shutdown in India. And then the other challenge, I think, is the multi-generational housing and urban settlements, which preclude social distancing. If you're living with 3-4 generations in a house, how do you preserve the older or the immunocompromised members of the family when you're in a very small home together? And similarly, how do you manage that when suddenly you have this influx of people from the cities where the infection often arrives first in the large capital cities, suddenly dispersing and spreading potential infection right throughout the rural areas? So these are significant challenges, and
Alison, we seem to have lost you. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, that's unfortunate. We seem
sorry,
to...
I'm back now. But where were you up to, Ben? Was that
you had, well, I don't know if I dropped out at the same time as everyone else, but you really just finished saying these are the significant challenges.
Oh, okay. So very quickly, and then I'll finish because I think it's my internet. There are issues around gender and COVID-19 that are really important to consider. The issues of domestic violence reports increasing in settings under lockdown, routine health services and access to antenatal care and birthing care limited. And then finally, I'll just see if this works. Great. Can you see my screen now? There are some pluses. I think we're seeing revisiting of traditional roles as more people spending more time at home. Whether that would be the case in a somewhere like Nepal is questionable. There's a very nice policy brief, and I've got the link there for what's happening with COVID and children. But I think one of the really significant things is the increased risk of poverty, the interruption to learning. I think that something like 3/4 of the world's children, 4/5 of the world's children are not at school currently. And there'll be lots of inequities around access to other, the digital learning that our kids are doing at the moment here. And the child protection issues. If you've got a family under stress and a child in that home, these are really important considerations. Finally, one last slide was, I was thinking about what this means for Christian communities. And I think that we really want to focus on those for whom social distancing presents risks. We really need to look at novel ways for community connectedness. I think it is a chance to do things differently. You think of Marie Kondo, and her strategy is to take everything off and then only put what you need back. And I think we're doing that with our life at the moment, and maybe we might find that we don't need everything. But I think the final piece is this trust and information. And particularly I think in a lot of low and middle income countries, in the church, there's a real challenge of the theology of a pandemic, that people might interpret it as a judgment, or that, you show your spirituality by avoiding, that not following through on social distancing, that's your, you're trusting. And I think that we need very good, clear communication to really address that risk that's particular in faith-based communities. And then I think that challenge of, through all of this, where do we do our relationship building rather than being very reactive to this massive rate of change that is throwing everybody all together, but it's a measurable stress for everybody. I'll finish there. Sorry for the glitch in the middle. I've got a last slide of some resources which I'll share with Ben. He can share with you, but open to any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was wonderful, informative. The pause in your presentation, like it was almost like that moment where in a great story or something you really engage with, it looks like you're not going to make it to the end. So it was wonderful that you were able to come back. We've got a couple of questions or comments via the chat. So Paul, I
might stop sharing my screen then, and then I'll be able to see it.
Good idea. Paul is asking what you think of the criticisms of the WHO around it being too slow to call it a pandemic, initial resistance to travel bans or critique of travel bans. What's your take on that?
I think, look, in the midst of something like this, you're going to make mistakes. And I think that there's probably a lot that in hindsight and on review, people might have chosen, to do things differently. But if you compare this to the response of previous pandemics, I think WHO have done remarkably well. And I think that some of the criticism has been to deflect domestic errors. I think that's particularly the case in the case of the US, that, you know, you deflect blame. I think that if you look at the guidance that's being given from WHO, the importance of that, you know, WHO is a member organisation. It is our country is there. Every country is represented. It's only as good as its own membership. And so really by criticising WHO, we're also criticising our own involvement in it. I think partly the calling a pandemic, yes, they probably should have called that earlier, not because it made any difference, because, as I said, calling it a global health emergency of international concern triggers all of the same responses. But as a messaging piece to everybody, that would have been helpful. The travel bans, interestingly, you know, by the time even, you know, when the US shut the border with China and they touted that as their big success, 40,000 people from China came into the US after that on other flights. So, and the DNA of if you look at well, not the DNA, the RNA, the genetic material origins of most of the epidemic in, say, the US have come from Europe, if you look at especially on the East Coast. So I think that the closing the borders probably protects those from leaving rather than the entry point. In Australia, we closed our border with China and then Japan, then Italy, but we didn't close it with the US, which was where most of our imported infections came from. So either you go all out and say, well, we're an island, we can shut and just stop everybody coming in. I think probably WHO's probably right on that, but the optics of it possibly made them look like it proved them incorrect.
Thank you. I also love that you couldn't cope with referring to the DNA of a virus. I think that's wonderful. Julie has asked, what would you recommend Christians focus on, be advocates for, be praying for in terms of thinking about about COVID-19 globally?
Thanks, Julie. I think, can I out you as Ben's friend who should have been doing this stuff? I think the main priority is about clear communication and being really supportive of the community and looking at doing things differently, because there will be lots of people in any Christian community that are really struggling, and having open channels of communication so people feel able to own it when that is really difficult, and maybe they are at risk. But I think for I think where the church really is at risk is of misinformation or putting a front up that somehow they've got some holy protection. We've seen also this in some religious communities where people's faith has been tested. You know, I'm covered by my faith, and in lots of different faith-based communities this is borne out. And I think that is, you know, reframing it. You know, you are loving your neighbor by, you know, following these guidelines, and then supporting in all of those small ways that we've seen communities really rise up in lots of settings. The other thing I think is that while, you know, we've got these lovely ways of saying health workers are fantastic, whether it's every night at 7 o'clock in New York or weekly in the US, in the UK. But in a lot of countries, I think there's going to be, and we've seen this already happening in Papua New Guinea, that there's increased stigma and discrimination if you're a health worker or if you're infection, similar to early days of the HIV epidemic. So health workers are, you know, they're bearing the brunt of caring for people, and then they're coming home and their village is sort of shunning them because they're frightened. And so being someone who can show that love and care to those who are dealing with it, I think will be really important as well.
Thank you so much. We've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to hold them until the end. We're looking, I'll just flag for people, it's looking like we might run about 5 minutes over the hour.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. That's all right. That's on me as the host and facilitator. So I hope everybody is okay with finishing around 9:05 or 9:05 Sydney time. But I'll hand, sorry, I'll hand over to Krishna Adhikari, who is the Executive Director of INF Nepal. And Krishna, I'll just ask you, as you come on, if you would just introduce yourself, a little bit of your background, and then you can go straight into your presentation. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you all today. And thank you, Ben. Thank you for this opportunity to be with everyone and share a little bit about Nepal and how we are doing in INF in Nepal. My name is Krishna Adhikari. I work with INF. I have been with INF for last more than 28 years. And I said that I actually grew up in INF and getting old in INF. I don't know whether I can say that I am going to retire from INF or not. So I have a family, wife, and one son. I think so. At the moment, I'm leading INF Nepal as an executive director. I took over these positions since July 2018. So I think that's all I can say at the moment. So can I move on to the sessions?
Yes, please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Alison. It was good to hear a more wider picture, what is happening globally with the coronavirus things. And also thank you for including Nepal in your talk. And I can definitely see that you have a heart for Nepal also. And we are pleased to hear that from you. So I'm going to do two things. One is I'm going to switch off my video because I feel comfortable when I'm not on the video. And the other thing, I'm going to share my screen with you at PowerPoint presentations. So let me share my screen with you. So has it worked? Can you all see that?
Yes, we can, Krishna.
No, thank you. Yeah, so I have prepared a brief PowerPoint presentations. It is more about Nepal in general and INF in general. So you'll have some questions or queries, but I can also see my colleagues here in Nepal and we'll together probably try to respond to those queries if you have. So what I have laid out my presentation in three areas. One is general situation in Nepal and responses and preparedness, including INF, and some personal reflection. Lockdown in Nepal started in March 24, and second lockdown was extended until 27th April, that is today. And government has announced further extension by another 10 days, and that goes until 7th of May. So this is a picture from Kathmandu, a crowdy with so many houses, but quite on the road. You can see that. Just a bit of statistics from yesterday. About 9,932 cases tested, 52 positive cases found, and most of them are between the age of 20 to 29. And I was wondering, why is that? We can see that many of our young people working abroad or Emirates and other countries and India. So 16 have been recovered and so far 0 mortality. And I was also looking at the country's statistic, number of beds are 13,481, number of ICU beds 777, number of ventilators 201, number of isolation beds 612 in different hospitals in the country. Government claims situation is normal compared to most of the countries and is able to control the situations. So future plans are not only built on these assumptions, not thinking that there will be severe outbreak, and people don't have answer if there is a severe outbreak, then what will happen? The government is claiming that we are under control. This is from Ministry of Health and Populations, and you can see the link if you want to visit the statistic there. The health issues mainly because of the open border with India. As Alison also covered in her talk, that thousands of people came in the country, so mainly in the far west regions and the remote area. They have already gone to their places, and also so many people are coming from Europe and other countries also. Most of the cases, I think many of the cases, they were found there from within the people. They travel from India and Europe and other countries. So another one is health facilities and infrastructure. Not enough health structure and facilities available. The hospitals in the beginning were very uncomfortable. They were not taking the patients, even normal patients. And however, it seems that now more hospitals are prepared, and government is also purchasing and organizing the health equipments, including PPEs, though they will be very still insufficient if there is a crisis in the country. Another one is mental health issues. I'm sure there are psychosocial and trauma issues, mainly due to the reasons that people have lost their investment, farmers, business houses, and because people have been locked down, they're not used with this. And some people are saying that they use alcohol just to spend time. In the beginning, they thought that it was like a band strike, so that they could go for work in the morning and in the evening. Once police started telling them off, so they now realize though it is self-quarantine. So that will mean that the domestic violence will increase. I think it is increasing. For people living on their daily earnings, they are really vulnerable situations and are most likely affected with the COVID-19, and their children. For them, daily survival is the top priority rather than trying to be cautious and save life from coronavirus. Daily living is their top priority. Economy, these are the tourism, remittance, decrease in national savings, and agriculture. These are the major contributors in Nepal's economy. Government had announced the tourism year 2020, but they had to cancel it now. All these, that will contribute maybe about nearly half of the national economy: tourism, remittance from overseas, and other earnings and agriculture. This has affected the investments. People had really made a large investment in the tourism and building the hotels, building the facilities, thinking that this is going to be a large earning opportunity for 2020. But they have lost their investment. It is fixed with that buildings and the facilities also. Because of job cuts and people returning from overseas, there is and will be significant reduction in remittance. People investing in the business in overseas, some business people are there investing in Europe, America, in Australia, and in other countries also. They are already facing challenges to survive. And that means Nepal will lose its significant income from overseas. And due to the lockdown also, farmers have already lost their investment and revenue. Another one is financial sector, economic, GDP, inflation, economic growth, stock market. Financial sector are already struggling. They are looking for the break-even situation at the end of this fiscal year. Otherwise, we can imagine most of them will go in loss. No deposit, no investment in the project. Economic growth has already fallen. significantly. Stock market will go into troubles as the banks and investors will not see this as a priority to provide the loans. Government public borrowing, government needs to prioritize and invest in the health areas, and it will collect the funds from public. That means there will be less available for non-governmental sector and institutes and industry. That can also create a liquidity problem in the market. Then another one is unemployment. There will be definitely job loss, job cut in the country, and people coming from outside, from abroad, will add significantly to that problem. But in another hand, we also see this as an opportunity. People coming, the skill level, the people coming to the country. And if we can create some small business, also agricultural things, I think that's the opportunity to start on dependency. The other one is supply chain, mainly within the country and outside, because Nepal is heavily dependent on China and India. So how the faster growth of coronavirus in India has affected largely. Also, because of the lack of transportation, all those things, people are not able to supply the products they have. So they are just wasting and throwing away. The other one is consumer behavior, purchasing power. What we can see in the last 1 month that people are now becoming more cautious. We can already see the changes in the behavior in the people's, how they spend and what they think about the future. What we think, even the daily wage worker will now start thinking that they will not say that, okay, I will earn today and I will spend it, but they will think about the future. So there will be less spending and behavioral change will be there. And because of so many people, unemployment, all these things, the people's purchasing power will be less. And also there will be job cut, low salary, all these things means that low purchasing power. So what government is trying, we can't see any major significant step, but there are something that government has taken decisions, which I would like to go through with you. The lockdown, obviously, it's a good thing that was started even before India. I think if it had not locked down, social distance was not enforced, then it would be, we would be very in different situation today in a month time. And import prioritization restriction, government, one of the things government said that no luxury vehicles will be imported. So that's one of the reasons they make. And order to hospitals and health centers, from the very beginning, they said, okay, you need to be prepared, you need to be taking patients, but that was a reluctancy in the beginning. But now it is improving and hospitals are preparing and that are following the order from the government. Relaxations and relief and exemption on some of the things that is government has issued relief on bank interest, electricity bills, house rent, and more talk is going on the business subsidy and taxation relief. The business people are doing their dialogues with the government. Insurance system, government introduced the insurance system for especially for those who are the frontline workers that include medical people and security and others. A central bank's policy we call Nepal Rashtra Bank. So Nepal Rashtra Bank is working to protect especially the financial crash and also to support the middle and small types of business where they could inject and also give loans and subsidy. If financial sector goes crash, and that will be disasters. Yeah. And I would like to take you to INF response to COVID-19 very briefly. One thing is to remain focused on its vision and mandate. So we don't want to lose our vision and mandate by focusing on the problems. The COVID-19 will not change our vision and mandate. Our vision, life in all its fullness for poor and disadvantaged people of Nepal. Our mandate is we love people because of Jesus. So that will not change. There will be probably more opportunity to serve people with the limited resources because of the poverty, hunger, and unemployment, all these things. Staff safety, security, and their mental well-being is a key. We have been providing support and training and care to the staff. We set up the prayer coordination team hotline system where staff could contact and share their problems if they have medical issues, mental issues, and other physical issues. We also introduced the insurance scheme. Normally that was not in the system before to cover the loss of the COVID-19 effect of the COVID-19. Action plan, we set up the COVID-19 response team, and under that different task forces that is looking at medical aspect for the hospitals and communities, community programs, and also communication with the partners and disaster response, relief, all these things. We also have worked on the contingency plan that have been developed based on different scenarios for both hospitals at organization level and also for the community programs. And of course, they keep changing in this uncertainty. And we are also reviewing our plans and strategy. Mainly short term, we are saying that in the next about next 3 months. Midterm is another 12 months, long-term 5 year that we were already starting before the COVID-19 came. One of the immediate things we are working on this, our project agreement with the government social welfare council. So we are looking what less we'll be doing, what more we'll be doing, what will be the effect from the COVID-19. So we are working on that. Cost cutting and budget prioritization, we have already started looking into that. Due to the significant cut in income from both overseas and local level, we are so thankful that all of our partners are not saying that we'll reduce, but they are allowing us, how can you see it differently? And they're also allowing us to use the underspent to respond to the COVID-19. I'm so grateful, and INF, from INF, I would like to thank all the partners for that flexibility. So that means we have limited resource, but we need to move on. And there will be reduction in the staff cost, allowances, we have to cut. Some staff probably need to go on a part-time basis. Some services will be outsourced. And this is going to be painful for both organizations, for the leaders and for staff and for the communities as well. But our intention, our aim is that we would like to continue serving people, more people, poor and vulnerable people. We'll be going with the strategy, survive to thrive. We don't plan to end, but to survive and slowly pick up and flourish. I would like to run through a couple of glimpses that what we did, the photos here. It is about our preparedness and response from INF in different ways. So coordinating with the province government and the response team, discussing about the plans and reviewing the situations. The fever clinic established and working with the province government, screening people when they enter into the hospital. This is mainly in Pokhara and Green Pasture Hospital, fever clinic. And we have also set up isolation wards in the Green Pasture complex that is in one of our center that is called Ear Center. There are about 12 beds, and where you can see that we can put, if there's a coronavirus patient, we can put there. And also supporting provincial government with communication system. Our staff involving in making locally producing the masks and for staff and for patients in the hospitals. And our staff involved in the hospital is in provincial hospital in Karnali province. This is Dr. Sarli. Some of you know she is here joining us. And this is the response, food distribution. And this one of the vulnerable group, people living with disabilities. So giving them awareness training. More photos, in-house training, preparedness, and training to non-medical staff how to use those PPEs. I'm nearly there. So personal reflection is most of the time you go to bed with the question that how and when this is going to end. Can we all imagine the day when we hear that the vaccine has been developed? But there is also fear that if not, if it goes worse, if it goes even worse, what is going to happen? How are we going to deal with the issues and how are you going to survive? Many times you don't have your answer, and the only one way is to rely on God, trusting him. He has a better plan that we don't know, but also move on with the prayers and action. The need to build resilience, there is a need to be stronger, work in a solidarity and build resilience with oneself, family, and the team. We know it is not easy, but we have to be intentional and help ourselves and hope for the best and prepared for the worst. The opportunity to deal things differently, that was also covered in Alison's talk also. In the next couple of months, the social distance will continue, travel will be difficult, supply will be limited, and we need to find a way to continue life and the business. For example, virtual meetings have come into practice in Nepal also. Normally in our culture, we prefer face-to-face meetings. That's the comfortable things, but now we are getting used to with this. We have started our board meeting virtually using Zoom. It was last week. Being prepared to undertake the difficult decisions, we got to prepare and we are committed to our vision and mandate. We have to look for the way that we continue serving the poor and disadvantaged. But we also know the limitations of our resources. This means we'll have to downsize some of the works, as I said already. That will be a painful decision, but it has forced us to do that for the good reasons. The last one, I would like to reflect from the verse from the Bible. The Lord will guide you continually, giving you water when you are dry and restoring your strength. You'll be like a well-watered garden, like an ever-flowing spring. Isaiah 58:11. So sometimes God closes doors because it's a time to move forward. He knows you won't move unless your circumstances force you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krishna. And thanks again to Alison. Thanks to both of you for such informative, stimulating, reflective presentations. And I want to echo what Kelly has said, that both your expertise, but also your personal reflections, it's really helpful for us to hear as we're all wrestling with this as well. A couple of questions that have come up. So I might ask Krishna, if you wouldn't mind just stopping sharing your screen now.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And I might have Krishna answer initially, and then we'll go for just about 5 minutes of question time. So we will finish at 10 past, so 10 minutes over the advertised time. I think Raju earlier asked, what are the areas that faith-based organizations could really focus their efforts, their thinking and their preparation for kind of the response and recovery? What areas do we see faith-based NGOs, maybe even church groups connected with their communities, playing a particular role? And Krishna, I don't know if you've got personal experience of observing what other organizations or church groups are doing, or if you have a perspective. And then I might ask Alison if you'd share your thoughts about that question as well.
I think Raju himself can answer that question from us ultimately.
Yeah.
The Apostolic Christian community is doing a marvelous job, and we are also working on that. INF is also doing that as a faith-based organization, trying to work with Christian organizations and do partnership where possible. One of the good things, I think that's a uniqueness for the faith-based organization, that they go out and work with the people, serve the people in need. That's what I see. And even this difficult situation, maybe that's something that other people can also add to. And that's, it's more kind of, I see, general questions to all faith-based organizations.
And Alison, do you have any thoughts or reflections from where you sit, where you can see, particularly in the global south, faith-based organizations playing a role in response and recovery?
I think there'll be a big role in response and recovery, and I think it will be around having trusted relationships with communities, so that people want to engage. The faith-based community was a big part of the response to HIV. Sorry, you don't want to look at Ted. The faith-based community was a big response to, was a big part of the response for love and support for those affected by HIV. And I think the same thing can play a big part. The communities are in every community. They are, they know the real concerns. They can be much more responsive, I think. So I think they're making the links with government and stakeholders, being a trusted agent for supporting networks, and then loving people, I think, is the best thing churches can do.
Absolutely. Raju's also asked, will there be a COVID-19 response framework or tool or resource for faith-based organizations and churches, a resource they can draw on? I mean, I think some of the things, Alison, that you've presented and that Krishna has presented, I'll upload the PowerPoint presentations, and those links are there for people to go to. So certainly we can be gathering those materials together now. But I am interested in, has anyone come across something that does that work of educating? And particularly, I was struck, Alison, by you saying the particular theological challenges of large parts of the church struggling with things like pandemic. And I've been thinking about and responding to climate change as a concern for quite some time. And some of the same issues come up of people thinking, well, God's faithfulness must mean that the climate can't change, or God's sovereignty must mean that human beings can't influence the planet on a global scale, or God's goodness must mean that I and my community and my world can't come to or experience significant harm or disruption, even civilizational level harm and disruption. And I don't know if you've come across things that you think are really helpful for helping us faithfully to think through and respond to some of these issues.
I notice in some of the comments that Tear Fund has, people have mentioned Tear Fund has some good resources, and that's very true. I think others, there's quite a neat example in the Pacific. The Bob Mitchell, who heads up the Anglican Overseas Aid here in Melbourne, did a whole piece on the theology of disaster relief and engaging faith-based communities in the Pacific, where there's a lot of, cyclones and flooding and other disasters. And they have, and where the churches there have felt, well, that's just, a sort of fatalistic view of, and so preparedness is seen as a, not being very faithful. So having a real theology of disaster preparedness has been really important, and DFAT, the Australian government, has got on board with supporting that integration in churches. So I think there is a lot that the church can do in really understanding how we understand a pandemic in the context of, the whole world's history and what God has planned for it. So, but I don't know of anything else in particular, but it looks like quite a few things coming up on the chats of others who have some of those resources.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to Megan and Lana. Megan's reflections about the opportunity that in Nepal exists for Christians to engage, to partner with local government, to support local government efforts to respond, I think is really helpful observation. And then Lana has shared a link to some of the Tier Fund resource materials and some stuff from Harvard. So thank you, Lana. I'll make sure those links get added to the final documentation as well that people can take away from tonight. Look, I have just a question again to both of you. So maybe Alison first and then Krishna. Obviously what's working in Australia is, the lockdown is working. Our extreme social distancing and so on is working. Our health system is not being overwhelmed. Our cases are coming down and so forth. And the economic cost is probably manageable, but we already can see that it's particularly manageable for those of us who are securely employed, who have access to technology, etc. You've flagged a lot of the equity issues around schooling, people in poverty, casual workers in Australia we can see are in a particularly vulnerable position, international students resident in Australia are particularly vulnerable, etc. What's your perspective on, in a context like Nepal, where you have people dependent on daily wage labour, dependent on the activity of everyday markets for food, and where the government, they will work to their best efforts to ensure that adequate food supplies are made available. But do you think, I guess my question is, just broadly, what is your take on the relative weight of those different challenges in different places, and whether countries like Nepal and elsewhere maybe should be considering different policy pathways, slightly different settings within their lockdowns, within their economic closures, etc., etc. What's your perspective, Alison, and then Krishna? I guess the same question, but what particular challenges do you observe personally?
Thanks, Ben. Very quickly, I think that the same approach around the social distancing and the quarantine and isolate, those principles are the same regardless of where you are. How they play out might look very, very differently. So in Zambia, for instance, in the rural areas, they have taken children out of the houses of elderly people and put them in huts next door so that they're not socially distanced, they're physically distanced, so they're not sleeping together, but during the day they'll be able to chat and talk to each other but not be very close. So they've been able to do that in rural areas, and I think parts of Nepal that's possibly possible to do. And in the urban areas, I know in India they're thinking, well, all our hotels are empty, why don't we put our elderly from urban settlements who cannot physically separate, who might be vulnerable, put them in some of these hostels and hotels that are standing empty. But again, that requires resourcing. But I think there are 40% of hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa do not have water and sanitation, and hand washing is, the big part of prevention of transmission. But already, I think we might come out of this, the other end, with better treatment for pneumonia, which is still the leading killer of children under 5. And we might come out with hospitals that at last have some running water and soap for women who are having babies. So I do think there are positives that will come out of this. It does need massive resourcing, and there are big funds coming out to provide that protection. When Modi locked down India, he made the state governments have to put up food stations all along those roads that people were, walking home to their villages. It was messy. It was really dangerous for women with 2,000 men queuing. So it wasn't a great solution. But, it isn't like governments aren't doing things. I think every government's really scrambling to do as good a job as they can, and that will take a very contextually specific appearance in each setting. I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, that's great. And Krishna, I mean, you picked up on the vulnerable people. You mentioned those in your presentation, but I'm just wondering if you could give us a picture of who you see as the most vulnerable and how you observe them, or how are people responding? How are they coping? What can you already see in terms of those vulnerable people and groups?
Thank you, Ben. As you already included that in your talk, that those mainly depending on their daily earnings, and in the last, from the day when the lockdown started, after third or fourth day, we had to respond to those needs there. Also, because of the lockdown and the border closed, all these things, so there's a lack of food supply also. But so far, when you go to the supermarket, you can see that the food is going down, the amount of food. And even the government said that we have got a stock for so many months, but we don't know whether that is, how true that is. So how we see that the lockdown, the further lockdown is, we heard that it is even going to be more stricted, because people were not, following that, but it is going to be difficult. Further lockdown is going to be difficult for the people. What I feel that I think there has to be some flexibility. There's no way that, depending on the food from outside, the stores are running out. And the good thing is that people will also focus on the garden or vegetable gardens or what they have. But especially in the urban area, city area, you don't have much land to grow the vegetables and those sort of things. So it is, we still question that what is going to happen if there is another month, the lockdown. The hunger will increase, and people will come out, and that's the situation we see. Some of my colleagues probably can add to that. Their insight to this. We had hoped that government will make it more kind of will make it loose in some areas, and so that people could go work. We can see some of the street in the street that some people are started working on that. For them, maintaining social distance, it doesn't come from their own kind of insight. It comes from the government. They see it. They have to earn. They have to work.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Look, thank you both, and thank you everybody for staying part of the webinar just for a little bit of extra time. I really appreciate everyone's patience. It was so informative, so stimulating. You both could have obviously spoken for much longer, even about, every slide had a presentation's worth of information on it. So thank you for all the work you've done in preparing and presenting. There's certainly a lot to take away and think about and respond to. I'd like to just finish by sharing my screen and just saying we've got a couple of colleagues on the call from Baptist World Aid, from TIR Australia, from Ashil Chimiki, Nepal, and obviously I represent INF Australia and Krishna INF Nepal. If you, as one practical step you can take, if you're in a position to, can I really encourage you to stand in solidarity in prayer, financially if you're able, with an organisation working with vulnerable communities, responding to coronavirus, but even beyond this pandemic, working with vulnerable communities to help build capacity and resilience and respond to the challenges they face. I've put up INF's coronavirus appeal. That's INF Australia's actually, it will take you to an Australian kind of payment portal. But if you are in a position to help with that, obviously we'd gratefully accept that. INF's challenges, Krishna has outlined the challenges faced by Nepal. He's outlined, and attempting to do all of this with fewer resources as donors are less able to share, as income from INF's, small income stream from INF's hospital dries up at this point as the hospitals are set aside for coronavirus response, isolation centres, etc. All of those challenges need support and resourcing to overcome. But if it's not INF, then please do find an organisation that you know and that you trust to do good work, and stand in solidarity and share in solidarity with them and with people experiencing poverty and vulnerability around our world. So at that point, I just want to, thank everybody again on behalf of everybody. Thank Alison and Krishna so much. Really informative. And I think the words that Inga has shared at the end of the chat at this point, that our hearts cry out for Nepal and the most vulnerable, and I think anywhere in the world, but tonight we've focused through Nepal to consider a global pandemic and its impacts, and our prayers and thoughts are with you, Krishna, and with everyone responding to this pandemic. So stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy and happy if you're able. Wash your hands, look after your loved ones, look out for your neighbours. I think Alison's words about us learning to love together, learning to love and watching out and making sure we're able to love health workers, vulnerable people and communities eventually as they recover. And yes, as Krishna says, let's stand together to fight this pandemic. So thank you all for taking the time. I will upload the material shortly, within a day or two, I hope, and then I'll send out links so that you can download the PowerPoint presentations and other resources. So good evening. Hope to see you on another webinar some other time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
You are absolutely very welcome. So wonderful to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Namaste. Samajana.
Hey,
Jai Masi.
terima kasih, Sabalai.